Ms. Rosenblum currently serves as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. In this capacity, she is the Principal Advisor to the Secretary, Deputy Secretary, and Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment on nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and biological and chemical programs. Prior to her position as Assistant Secretary of Defense, she was the Executive Vice President at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. As part of the Nuclear Threat Initiative's executive leadership team, she helped to oversee the organization's operations, development, and programs managing the annual operating budget. Please help me welcome Ms. Rosenblum and our panelists.
Thank you all for coming back. It's always the hardest to be the final element, notwithstanding General Cotton for the afternoon. I want to start off by giving a very big thank you to STRATCOM and to General Cotton, not only for hosting this conference, but for including a panel on the very difficult task of implementing deterrence. And what I mean by that is building and maintaining critical capabilities, including the command and control backbone of our nuclear forces. This esteemed panel works every day with the reality that a resilient defense industrial base is a strategic advantage for the United States and its allies, and is vitally important to our ability to successfully modernize all three legs of our nuclear triad. It is certainly no surprise to any of you in this room that we are challenged by the state of our defense industrial base and that of our allies. We're recovering from the impact of COVID. We're pivoting away from a just-in-time approach to manufacturing and logistics. And we're also dealing with the hollowing out in the United States of our manufacturing workforce. All of this is happening against an unprecedented number of current operations that are challenging our industrial base even further in real time to support our allies in Ukraine, Israel, and combat in the Red Sea. So I think we have a really interesting discussion to be had, so let's get started. I'm going to start by introducing each of our panelists to you in the order in which they're seated here on the panel. Immediately to my right is Mr. Doug Young, who is a Sector Vice President and General Manager of Strike at Northrop Grumman Aeronautical Systems. In this role, he oversees the Strike Division, which delivers highly survivable, long-range penetrating strike aircraft to support U.S. strategic deterrence. To his right is the Honorable David Norquist, who is currently the President and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association, or NDIA, that has does provide a platform through which leaders in government, industry, and academia can collaborate and provide solutions to advance the national security and defense needs of our nation as well as our allies. Prior to his role with NDIA, Mr. Norquist served as the 34th Deputy Secretary of Defense. Then to his right is the Honorable Eric Fanning, the President and CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association. AIA is the leading advocacy organization for the aerospace and defense industry. Prior to his role at AIA, Mr. Fanning served as the 22nd Secretary of the Army. He also has extensive experience working in Congress and in the White House. And at our end is Miss Elaine Bitonti, who leads the Connected Battlespace and Emerging Capabilities mission system for Collins Aerospace, a business of Raytheon Technologies. In her role, she is responsible for all aspects of Collins Aerospace Connected Battlespace strategy and its implementation. As I mentioned, these are truly some of the U.S. industry's top industry leaders, some representing individual companies in industry, some representing themselves, as well as their member organization, many with experience both inside and outside of government, and all with a pulse on the defense industrial base, which should make for a very healthy discussion for us today. I have asked each of our panelists to share a few opening remarks at the top, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation followed by questions from the audience. So now let's dive into our conversation. Doug?
So sure, I just want to start out by thanking the organizers and General Cotton for the opportunity to be here to speak today on this topic, because it really is a major element of satisfying all the needs that have been talked about for the last day or two. I would also like to thank them for including the B-2 there on the screen behind us. We just recently celebrated our first flight 35 years ago, a couple of weeks ago in Palmdale, California. So that part of the strategic triad is alive and well and still flying, but more on that later. Overall, the defense industrial base is under a lot of strain right now and has gone through a lot of consolidation over the last several decades. So it's much smaller than it was when it was modernized and built up in its first incarnation. At Northrop, we're really fortunate to be focused on a major element of supporting the deterrent force for our country. In the case of the air leg, the area where I'm focused every day is on the B-2 and the B-21 and other operational systems that go within the family of systems that works in the A2AD environment, the highly contested environment. From the land-based leg, we are doing the Sentinel program and are sustaining the Minuteman program, which is the one that is currently in place. So kind of like with the air leg, but with the land leg as well, we're accountable for supporting the performance of the existing system before it's taken over by the new system, which we are also developing. And then finally, on the sea leg of the triad, we provide the propulsion components for the Columbia-class submarines, as well as for the Trident D5. So really working across the entire triad. So obviously this conference and the discourse here is extremely important to us. So as I look out and manage my daily business in terms of execution and how does that relate to some of the topics here we want to talk about, two of the things that I focus on in terms of what I can do to alter the outcome is around partnerships and is around digital. So in those two cases, those are areas where we put a lot of focus as we attack these challenges that are being talked about. Three challenges I would refer to would be speed and agility. How do we get capabilities onto these platforms more rapidly? The second would be supply chain. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, the workforce. Those three things are really dictating the outcome, at least for where we see ourselves as in terms of executing and performing and delivering these capabilities. In the case of speed and agility, very much focus on how we get after the requirement set, work with our customer in terms of stable requirements. If we use the B-21 as an exemplar, active contract management in partnership has allowed us to manage risk and allowed us to stay on schedule to deliver that capability per the acquisition baseline. And so those flexible agreements and arrangements that we've made have allowed us to be successful. At the same time, the RCO has been very disciplined with the Air Force on keeping stable requirements, because those requirements, when they change, create a lot of disruption in bringing that capability online. And then within those requirements, building in open architecture capability in order to be able to rapidly adapt, even as we're bringing that capability online, to the threat that's moving at us. So open architectures, and then obviously into the realm of software, we could talk about a lot of other things maybe later in the conversation about digital and how that's affecting the outcome and partnerships. In terms of supply base, the supply base is under extreme stress. It actually was before 2020, because there was a lot of consolidation in the industry. Lead times were already getting longer, and then came COVID and a major disruption there. And then finally, macroeconomic occurrences has really put a bind on a lot of small companies that are financially bound to certain contracts. And when macroeconomics changes the labor rates that we all have to pay by factors, then we start to suffer financial consequences in our supply base that we have to go address. We have to deploy resources to help them. We have to find ways to work through those. And in many cases, we're sole source in key areas. So developing those second sources, investing in capacity in that supply chain is critical. And then finally, on workforce, we are in an active competition for resources. I know all of you are experiencing a similar thing that's related to the demographics over time, the bimodal distribution of the aging workforce. Some call it the gray to green of the workforce. And for us in aerospace and defense, we are competing for a lot of the same skills and resources that the big five tech companies are. And if you think of scale, the entire aerospace industry is a little bit over $1 trillion market cap. Apple alone is over 3. So if you look at the 5 top tech companies and the fact that they need software engineers, they need the same types of engineers and capabilities that we're going after, we're almost a niche. And on top of that, we have to have security clearances in many cases. So it really becomes a challenge. So then how do you deploy your resources to go after those folks and do it in such a way that you're building the pipeline while at the same time attracting them to do this kind of work? So a lot of challenges that we go after there. So just to finally say that, you know, in hearing a lot of the things in the dialogue over the last day or so, the trilateral, if you will, or the three-body problem of competitive geopolitical forces has really put us all in a place where we've got to look at ways to scale up and build capacity much more rapidly. And if we go back to World War II and the last Cold War, as was mentioned this morning, I almost could see us, is this our generation's arsenal of democracy moment? Do we have to really change the way we're doing business here, or we're not going to be able to meet the threat that's moving at us rapidly?
Wonderful. Thanks, Doug. Dave?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to the command for inviting us and for inviting me. The thing is, as she mentioned, my organization does a lot of bringing different groups together. So I also want to give a shout out to anyone in the command who organized this. I am painfully aware of how hard it is to get this many name cards right, this many badges right, this many people informed and in the right place with the right meal. So well done for all of them. It's a lot of work to make it look seamless. So thank you to that community. So I'm going to focus very briefly on 2 aspects of the defense industrial base. One is capacity and the other is innovation. And when you talk about capacity, I want you to think about the role of the triad in deterrence, which is if our nuclear deterrent was non-existent or very small, another country would be convinced that either they would either be able to destroy ours or they would be able to act with impunity because they knew that we would be unable to resist. In a conventional conflict, one of the things that each country looks at the other and asks themselves is, if this goes on, who wins the long war? Because with major powers, and we've seen this with Ukraine, conflicts you think are going to be short turn out to be very long. And if they believe that in the long run you will lose because their industrial capacity is significantly greater than yours, you are not deterring conflict, you are at the risk of inviting it. So the ability to have an industrial base that can, over a multi-year period, produce the quantities and the types of munitions and equipment to prevail in a conflict goes a long way to convincing other people, don't start the fight, it will not end well for you. The other thing I wanted to flag on is innovation. We have spent a lot of time talking about the many challenges that China presents, but I always think it's worthwhile to come back to 3 areas where the United States has advantages that China will not be able to duplicate. The first one is allies and partners. If you look at the network of countries, even just those who are formal allies of the United States, you are over 50% or about 50% of the world's GDP. Never mind the ones we partner with. With China, you can count their allies and you don't even need all the fingers on a single hand. That's just not the way they function with their client states. The second thing is non-commissioned officers. We empower our NCOs and train them to function differently than totalitarian and restrictive governments who do not trust them. That just allows us to function differently. If you remember when the Russians went into Ukraine, they had traffic jams. And those traffic jams persisted until a general officer showed up to clear the street. I cannot imagine a sergeant major waiting for a general officer before they would speak up to clear up a traffic jam, right? So from that to the low level to small unit tactics and innovation, those are things. The third one, which is relevant to this, is an innovative industrial base. I worked in the Pentagon. I love the people in the Pentagon. But if the only ideas we have for weapon systems come out of the Pentagon, we will not stay ahead. We will not be better communists than the Chinese and be better at central planning. Our advantage comes from working with industry to understand solutions and technologies that the department didn't know were out there, and incorporating them in ways that the department had not thought possible. We constantly have innovations going on in the commercial sector, in the defense industrial base, and the ability of our country to have government and industry work together to get those in the hands of the warfighter is a strategic advantage that can always put us a position ahead of the Chinese. So capacity is deterrence, innovation is a strategic advantage. I think just have those in your mind as we go through this, but that was sort of my brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Dave. Eric?
Thank you. Thank you to STRATCOM for including the industrial base as a part of your agenda, even if it's the last part of the agenda. So thank you to all staying through for these 2 days. Because, as David said, a healthy, robust industrial base is a deterrent. So I'm glad we're talking about this as a part of a deterrence conference. And I'm editing my comments as I go, being the third, sorry, person, because I don't want to repeat some things. But just a couple of quick observations before we go in. And part of it is what I learned after 12 years in the Pentagon, I think, time on the Hill in the White House. I thought I knew the industrial base because I was a customer for so many years. I knew who the companies were, I knew who the CEOs were, I knew what they were making, but I really didn't understand how you incentivize the industrial base and what it reacts to. And a lot of attention has been placed on the industrial base, I think for two reasons, aside from the perturbations of macroeconomics and COVID. First, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the second is us reimagining or rethinking or reassessing our relationship with China and where that may go, an adversary with whom we have an economic relationship like we've never had before, not in our lifetimes. On the Ukraine issue, as Dave was pointing out, we realized very quickly we don't have the capacity for the long fight, and we learned that capacity is a capability in and of itself. And it's not because there's some inherent problem with the industrial base. The U.S. industrial base is the best in the world. It makes the best stuff in the world. Everybody wants it. It has to do with something I didn't really think about, which is this enormous industrial base. There's a few things about it. One, it kind of has one customer. And the decisions of that customer over many, many, many years shape the contours of the industrial base. I sat in a lot of budget meetings. David sat in even more budget meetings. In the end, you make these trade-offs. And one of the things that was easy to make trade-offs on, because you can take risk there, is munitions. You can't buy 80% of an aircraft carrier. You might try, but you can buy 80% of your munitions. If you do that year after year after year after year, not only do your supplies deplete over time, but the industrial base shapes around that demand signal. There has to be a return on investment for these companies, and it needs to come from its singular customer. I have this analogy that is oversimplistic, I think, but it seems to resonate, that we treat the industrial base like a hardware store. We buy a hammer, then 20 years later when the hammer breaks, we go and we try to get another hammer. Well, it's not like Ace around the corner where they're selling to thousands of different people that spread that demand signal out in a way that it's sustainable. There are no hammers, and in fact, there's no ability to make the hammers anymore. The workforce shifts, the CapEx, the facilities change. Your supply chain is retargeted. And so it'd be very hard, as we're seeing in Ukraine, to get that back, but also these investments for that sustained capacity just don't compete well in the end game. We're focused on it now. I hope we maintain that focus, but who knows what we'll be doing in 5 years in terms of how we're planning and what we're buying and what we're resourcing. Because in the end, if you can buy something that you can stick on an airbase or at a pier versus investing in something that you might notionally need, you see what wins every single time. So the second thing then, of course, is time. These things happen over a long period of time. I see a lot of Air Force uniforms in this room. When I was the Undersecretary of the Air Force, we were dependent on a Russian engine to get us into space, the RD-180. And all of a sudden, everyone said, you can't do that anymore. Russia is an adversary. But that had been a 20-year arc to get to that point. The Soviet Union collapses. We are optimistic about what's going to happen with Russia and what direction they're going to take. And we pick space as an area where we're going to cooperate, bring them closer to us. And that cooperation worked really well. Those were great engines. And so we didn't need to make them in the United States anymore. It's the same with the supply chain now. We're seeing we're too dependent on some important materials, raw materials from Russia. We've got China too embedded into our supply chain, but it took us years to get that way. And if we're gonna try and correct that and pivot quickly, that also takes an investment. It takes a sustained investment to send a signal to the private sector, to industry, that they have to pivot. And I would just say one other thing that I noticed when I left government and took the job at AIA. It was 2018. Very soon after that, the MAX crashes happened. Then we had COVID. Now we have inflation, the war in Ukraine, our focus on China. The supply chain isn't where we want it to be, and at the same time, very stressed for a lot of different reasons. But there's one other thing I'd ask us to think about, which I didn't when I was in government. There isn't a walled-off defense industrial base that exists only for the Department of Defense. A lot of companies in the defense industrial base are also doing non-defense work, which means they have an option. It was fantastic for the support of the industry when COVID hit. David was comptroller, then the Deputy Secretary of Defense during that. The Department of Defense was accelerating payments to defense companies. That was also propping up the commercial aviation side of aerospace and companies that have their foot in both sides, and was really important for the industry. The flip side of that is when government makes it too hard to do work, a lot of these companies have options to go someplace else. And our defense industrial base, especially the big companies, are seeing this. I had one member, it actually may have been one of David's members, I think, at one of our meetings, saying that her supplier was willing to pay the penalty to not deliver to her because she could raise the prices with inflation more than enough to cover that penalty and make an increased profit. And so we always have to think about decisions we make as policymakers or as customers and how it might push people out of the industrial base in other directions. When you have a stressed supply chain, that usually means they have options to go someplace else. So I'll close by just going back to what I said from the beginning. The industrial base has one customer, and that customer needs to be thinking about how it takes care of that industrial base in the long run. And inflation right now, industry is kind of absorbing that. Wait till the next round of contracts come. The Pentagon is very good at pushing problems into the future. Someone once told me the most interesting year in the budget is, in the FIDIP, is year 6, where all the problems are hid. And I think inflation's a part of that too. But right now, I hear people in government, former colleagues of mine, former colleagues of David's, saying, okay, we seem to have managed inflation by putting a lot of stress on the industrial base. And as we have a consolidated industrial base, we need to be extra careful that we're not doing things that cause long-term harm to it as the one customer for it. Again, thank you for bringing this agenda item into this conference. I look forward to the conversation and the questions.
Thanks, Eric. Elaine?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having Collins Aerospace on the panel. I think Eric was maybe looking at some of my notes as he talked about companies that have interest in both the defense and the commercial side. Collins Aerospace is one of those companies, so we have about 60% of our business is commercial aviation, other 40% is defense. Then, of course, we have our sister business, Raytheon, that is primarily all defense. So that gives an interesting perspective that I'm going to bring to this panel. I think the other interesting perspective we have is what we do at Collins Aerospace is we don't make any of the actual aircraft, right, submarines, et cetera. But what we do make is all the systems that underpin those and allow those to work. So we're central to all of the NC3 systems, all of the strategic communication systems that those systems rely on to deliver messages at the end of the day. And this gives us a unique perspective to see across, I would say, multiple services and participate in multiple, with multiple OEMs. Across what's going on in nuclear modernization. And so I think when I talk today about the things that we see that are really impacting the defense industrial base, I'm going to talk much more left of where there's been a lot of focus since the pandemic, which has been on increasing production capacity. Rightfully so, that's been a focus. But I want to highlight there's many other areas far left of that impact the defense industrial base before we even ever talk about something coming off of the production line. So I'm going to highlight 3 things here today. The first is, and the gentleman from Northrop Grumman mentioned it as well, the ability to have the right security infrastructure to actually prosecute these programs. I will say this is a challenge that we see across all services that we support for nuclear modernization. And I think it's really important to remember, and I think this is something when we talk with our government customers, they maybe don't view this problem as acutely as we do. Even if industry is willing to invest ahead of a program, ahead of knowing if we've won, even if we go build out the classified infrastructure, the time it takes to get that infrastructure certified and accredited is 2x the time it takes us to build it. So even if I invest, even if I do things ahead and I accelerate things on my end, we're seeing, I would say, a lot of pressure on how do we get the infrastructure accredited by the government agencies that hold that authority so we can be ready to do this work. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as a government industry team to talk about what is the staffing in those agencies that are responsible for accreditation. Are they staffed appropriately, and how do we get through some of the roadblocks, because there was a lot of discussion yesterday about urgency and needing to operate with a sense of urgency. I think all of our teams, feel that. They're very committed to the mission, but there's nothing that kills the urgency more than when I have engineers on what we call waiting for assignment, which means we have them, they're on board, and I don't have my infrastructure ready for them to begin working because I'm waiting on accreditation timelines that don't support the volume of nuclear modernization that's currently occurring. So I think that's one challenge that occurs very left in the process that we need to think about. The other challenge, I would say, is related to our certification processes. So all the systems that we make have to be certified long before we ever begin production. On some of the systems in my business, we have 4 or 5 different certifications that we must acquire before we can even begin production. And I would say we have not modernized any really of our certification processes probably since the Cold War. I wasn't around then, but none of them have changed. And I think the way we do work has changed significantly, right? Digital engineering, the advent of digital twins and digital models, this offers a lot of opportunities to reimagine how we can do certification, how we can streamline some of those processes. But I think that's an area that has largely been ignored as we think about how can we move faster together as a government industry team. And that one of the things that causes is that the need for certification becomes in conflict with our need for speed. And I think we can do a better job of having balance with both. And the last challenge that I would highlight from our perspective is the need to have security in our supply base, particularly with our electronic components. That is an area that can cause, I'll say, great deal of delay in our nuclear modernization programs if we don't have security in the supply base. If we find parts that we find are not trusted parts, counterfeit parts, causes significant redesign, right? That causes churn and elongates schedule. While there's been a lot of great investment from the U.S. government side in the CHIPS Act and things like ME Commons to help shore up the supply base for those type of electronic components, it's not fast enough, and I think there's other activities that we need to look at. A lot of those activities are focused, at the foundry level on how do we bring that capability back stateside. There's an equal amount of focus we could look at in how do we harden COTS parts that exist. There's very interesting new additive manufacturing techniques and other things that we could use in relation to COTS parts that would help us have the security that's needed, but cut down on the cost and the timeline, which are both important as we think about nuclear modernization. So I think those are 3 areas very far left that we need to focus on as a team and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you, Elaine. Before we get into the audience's questions, we're going to do a quick lightning round here to engage all of the panelists together in one question, and that is, what do you think is the most important but least well understood challenge that industry faces in the defense industrial base, particularly in the nuclear enterprise? So with that, let me start with you, Eric.
I think, well, since you, I had like 14 things that went in my head real quickly, but I think for the nuclear enterprise, which is consistent across the defense industrial base, sustained, predictable investment. I think we've had 120 continuing resolutions in the last 25 years. And policymakers make changes, not just to requirements, but to investments that they're making. This is a long, complex, expensive recapitalization, and it just gets longer and more expensive if the investment side isn't consistent and predictable so that industry can plan around it.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I'll take it in terms of two things. Really, it's the fragility of the supply chains. I'm talking about now second and third tier, as far as some of the things I mentioned earlier about history and how we've now reduced down to sole sources in many areas where we have one provider, and that provider really, their business is winnowed down based on some of the factors that have been talked about, and those are just one mistake away, one event away from breaking down, and then we run into major constraints and things that we're throwing money at it to work around. So being able to predict those is an important part of what we do every day, and the government focusing on that for investment is probably a key area. I think the other side of it is requirements. As it relates really to business requirements and being flexible, so the agility of our contracting process. I mentioned some of the things we've been doing recently with the RCO, and all that's being done within the 5,000 framework. It really comes down to relationships, decision authorities, and speed of which decisions are made that allow us to have the flexibility to adjust. And that's fully appreciated, that because across the industrial base, timelines are long, and a lot of it has to do with just our pure ability to do business deals to get things online. So those would be the two I'd point out.
So I'll just jump in in support of your point. For those who 17,000 companies in the last 5 years left the defense industrial base. DoD estimates that in the last 10 years, 40% of its small businesses no longer exist or no longer work with DoD. So when we talk about shrinking industrial base, that's the thing we mentioned about. And Eric rightfully foot stomps CRs. The cumulative effect of those CRs, which by the way tell you do not increase quantity and do not something new, is just about 5 years of delay. So when you wonder why we're behind on technology or why the munition ramp-up was delayed, it wasn't because we didn't ask for more guided multiple launch rockets. It's because every CR delayed the ramp-up of production, and now we have a shortage. So both of those very important points. The one I will flag is I don't think people fully understand the scale of the inflation hit. It's $110 billion, because inflation doesn't just disrupt the fiscal year that's right in front of you. The contracts and the budgets that were put out over the last several years are executed over the next several years. And so who gets jammed depends on which side of the award you are. If you're the contracting officer and you've received the budget and inflation happens, you're going to discover none of the bids are coming in at the rate you thought, because your budget was built without inflation and all the bidders knew about it. And you can't buy the capability the department needed. The flip side is the contract's already been awarded. And then industry is looking at the cost of labor, supplies, and materials going up, and it's got a fixed price contract. And when you think about like a woman-owned small business I worked with down in Huntsville, Alabama, they had a 5-year contract with 2% growth clause. That was never going to work out for them once the 10% inflation hit, and they were locked in for 4 years. The baker changes their price tomorrow morning. That person's stuck with that contract, and the best they can hope for is the government doesn't renew their option. That's the best way for them to get out of that dilemma. So the scale of that hit, the fact that it still exists and will exist for several more years on vendors who have multi-year contracts and is still harming their operations. And if they have subcontractors, those subcontractors, like Eric's saying, are just going somewhere else if they can all get out of it with the penalty. So the scale of that is often misunderstood.
Elaine, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I would say 2 items. The first, I would echo the statements about stability of funding. I mentioned, right, these programs require significant capital investment because the industrial base in this area has been neglected for so long. And so making sure that we have stable funding, we understand what those profiles are, and we understand that they're going to continue, so industry can invest in the right things at the right time. So that is one of the biggest challenges. Another challenge that I think is certainly well known, but we don't necessarily have a good solution for it, is regarding talent. You know, right now we're executing Sentinel in support of Northrop Grumman, SAOC in support of Sierra Nevada, and some of the comm systems for the new EXX, all simultaneously, and it's very, very hard to recruit the next generation of talent, right? They have to work in secured areas, many of which, if they are online, have not been updated in a very long time, and we're competing for that best engineering talent with the likes of Amazon and Google, and they don't even understand the importance of the mission, right? Or what it means to work in those areas. And I think we still haven't figured out, as a defense industrial base, you know, in partnership with the DoD, how do we make those engineering jobs some of the most sought after and some of the most, the places where people want to go, because the amount of talent that we need to hire immediately to execute on these programs is a very significant challenge, and I think there's more we need to do, thinking about how the newest generation values things, right? How they like to be communicated to. I think there's a lot we can learn and do better to attract the right talent for this mission.
Great. So now we're going to turn to your all's question, and the first one, which Elaine, I'll ask you to respond to, is if we think about a future single adversary, large conflict, let alone a dual adversary, there's been quite a bit of writing being done about the need for the United States to convert its manufacturing capability to more of a wartime footing. Is that even something that's realistic, and how would industry respond?
I do think that's something that is realistic and should be thought about. I think there have been a lot of advances in manufacturing, especially the digitization of manufacturing. I spoke about additive manufacturing as well, which are ways where we can do things more quickly. I think this would require, though, sustained dialogue with industry and the DoD, because there would have to be funding to go with that. And back to the point of the certainty, how long would those funding streams last? How would they be set up? But I think there's been a lot of discussion in earlier panels about emerging technology and how we can leverage it. Additive manufacturing is one of the things I think that could help here. But that needs to come with a sustained demand signal from the government.
Any of our other panelists want to comment on this one? Dave?
I think one of the things you have to look at is, how many shipyards do you have? So even if the government said, I want to triple the number of ships we're building, do you even have the shipyards? Or is your first project to build a shipyard and then to train the workforce? And then how many years are you in? So where you have capacity, where you have the ability, you can potentially ramp it up. But in some cases, the underlying capacity is there. So that is not there. So that's one of the challenges. And the other is the type of work. How many years of experience do you have with it to be proficient, versus where can technology help to close that gap?
I think we've touched on workforce a couple of times here. If you ask the CEOs of the companies at AIA what their biggest strategic concern is, it's almost universally workforce. But we have to be thinking about the government partner workforce as well, that it's sufficient, that it's trained, because technology is just getting, when you fold in AI increasingly on top of it, is getting more complex. And that is a real problem too, the other side of the workforce. This is another problem, though, that's decades in the making. I mean, you go back to the 90s when we started to gut apprenticeships and invest in community colleges, which is great. But I remember President Trump's first labor secretary saying he was down at a community college in Florida talking about needing welders, and the president of the school said, I'll create an associate's degree for welding. And asked, why would you have to do an associate's degree? That's the only way I can access federal funds, because we haven't aligned our investment in education and training with what our needs are. David's pointed out capacity, and talked about partnerships, and we're leaning into that in a way that we haven't for a long time. AUKUS is a great example of that, but we need to do more. That's a competitive advantage we have over our adversaries, all these partnerships. We have to do this together. We don't have the capacity in the United States to get on a wartime footing, whatever we mean by that. We have to do it collectively. We don't have the workforce to do it. We know we have to bring some things back to the United States. We've got our manufacturing capability, our supply chain. There's resilience to having a global supply chain, but there's risk to it too, and it's not balanced the way we think it should be. Both political parties are wanting to bring things back to the United States. We're already in a fight for workforce. Where is that workforce? We need to think about how we do this internationally, globally, with our partners to get that footing back. We have a new industrial base policy strategy. Deb worked on it that talks about cooperation. Europe just came out with a new strategy too. It talks about competition with the United States. So we have a lot of work to do there to recognize how we can get at this collectively internationally in a way that China and Russia can't, even though they are cooperating more than they have historically.
Doug?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is please be decisive as quickly as possible and be appreciative of what capital investment and how that relates to the business and how the business runs and has to stay reasonably profitable in order to satisfy our investors. So capital takes time, buildings, all that takes time, and those requirements have to be stable over that time scale. And if decisions get made, getting those codified and stuck into formality so that we can make those decisions on our end.
Great, thank you. The next question that comes from the audience is something I haven't heard any of our panelists mention yet, and that is on cyber threats and cybersecurity. And so one of the questions we have is, broadly, what are companies as well as the DIB doing or need to do to assure their mission from a cybersecurity perspective? Doug, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think cyber's at multiple levels. I guess the three bins I would put it in, first off, are the systems engineering of our designs has to account for it on the front end. The better we can do that to allow us to then have the proper partitions, partition the way processing works, and so on. Having that requirement formalized up front is good. It's starting to be more clear nowadays. It wasn't 5-10 years ago. So that's at the architecture level. At the supply chain level, we need help with the government, and that's alive and well on many programs, certainly in the nuclear enterprise, as to how we can control the sources all the way down to multiple levels, and also understand the threat to those sources. It gets very tricky when we have classified work and then we have suppliers doing unclassified work because their ability to hire is different than how we're working, so threats can find their way into the system. And then finally, the infrastructure we run on, the evolution of requirements, the ICD 705 jargon, but it is the thing that says what are your systems going to be standardized to. That threat is evolving, and once we implement an architecture and a infrastructure, being able to change that is very difficult. So getting those right up front is key in the infrastructure end of the business for security.
I'll just say that
Dave?
the cybersecurity challenge is very real. Companies see it every single day. The damage to the department for those sorts of compromises are significant, and so there's a lot of effort going into it. One of the challenges, though, is with the smaller businesses, when you look at the cybersecurity standards that are coming in, the cost to implement those are significant. And so when you talk about, as Eric's mentioned, a company who's partially government but heavily commercial, they may decide that the cost of upgrading to that standard is so high that they leave. They're not primes, they're subcontractors. So they leave the supply system. That makes a less resilient supply structure for those who are left. We try and warn folks and say, look, it's not that the non-defense guys aren't being attacked either. You're still going to need cybersecurity there. This isn't as clear a standard for you. But that's going to be one of our concerns, which is when we try and solve one problem on cybersecurity, we end up exacerbating a problem on supply chain, which is just unfortunately the nature of the challenge.
Yeah, this is a particularly pernicious problem, as everybody knows. It is an example, though, of how it is getting harder to do business with the government for real legitimate reasons. I mean, this is a real threat that we have to get at, but we have to work, I would say that this government industry partnership has to work together on this. We have to help the supply chain do this because the barriers are increasing to do work with government, and we have to think about that. And I keep going back to resource, but it is an investment that needs to be made to make sure that the supply chain is secure and that it's stable for the government going forward. And so this is I have this example in my head. I don't want to relive the torture of COVID, and in particular the vaccine mandate issue, which just roiled industry. And I remember one smaller company saying, when we were talking through this, he said, the defense side of my business is 10% of what I do, 90% non-defense. I will lose 40% of my workforce. The only way to get 100% people vaccinated is to fire the people who won't do it. He said, guess which one I'm going to pick? I'm going to keep that 40% of my workforce and just get rid of the defense business. Companies want to have cybersecurity. They need help to do it because just at the jump, a lot of them just can't afford it, especially the smaller companies. So we need to figure that out.
I think there's a different challenge whether you're a large or small company. When I mentioned, the 4 to 5 certifications, each of the products in our business have to go through. Cyber is one of them. So I would say I think we've done a good job in working with partners like Northrop Grumman, including the cyber vulnerability assessments very upfront as we do the system design. I think one of the challenges, though, that we see is the threat data and understanding how the threat data is evolving from a cyber perspective so that we can make sure that we're testing for the right vulnerabilities and we're designing for the right things. So I think obviously that that data is very sensitive, but that's something that needs to be shared in the right venues with the defense industrial base so that we can keep evolving the standards that we've already put in place.
And this is a good place to bring up CUI, which didn't exist when I was in government. We're making the problem more complex in many ways. I mean, industry doesn't necessarily know how to deal with this, especially as you get down through the supply chain. But to a point you made earlier, too, we have to think about compliance in a different way. It can't be a checklist of things because the threat is too dynamic and we can't keep up with it. We won't be able to address these challenges if we don't have accreditation. Think about it differently. Think about certification differently. Think about all these things that we do. I mean, even security clearances are more dynamic in how we track these things than we used to. And so we've got to work to figure out a new way of doing these things rather than just falling back on sending a bunch of auditors out with checklists.
Interesting question that's just come in. One of the audience members reflects on really the agreement amongst each of the panelists with regards to the nature of the challenges that are there right now in the DIB, but they make note that there are a few companies, they mentioned SpaceX, don't know if this is true or not, who do not seem to be afflicted by some of the same DIB-related challenges. One, do you agree with that? And two, are there things that can be learned by certain companies and the practices that they have done as it relates to the DIB? So I throw it out there to whoever wants to grab that one.
So I'll just start and point out that SpaceX had to sue the government to get a contract that reduced the cost of space launch to a fraction of its previous price. That we were still sufficiently resistant to that market that often some of the most innovative firms we talk about sued in order to be able to be recognized. So the barriers are there, and it's also a challenge. We've had a couple of firms break in, but if you have to be backed by a billionaire in order to survive the valley of death, you are not going to have the small business community that you are looking for. Those are rare exceptions, very exciting when they happen, but they have the ability to override a lot of the challenges that other firms simply have neither the funding nor the bandwidth to be able to survive.
The thing that was interesting about that lawsuit, because I was the Undersecretary of the Air Force when it was filed, is the Air Force sort of hunkered down like, no, our plan is better. It was the same with Palantir suing the Army. I happened to be the Secretary of the Army when that happened, so there's a track record here. But both services, it's like our plan is better. And those lawsuits weren't really about the capability. They were about competition. And so I think a way to think about the question is there are companies, the DIB is not monolithic. Even the defense primes are not monolithic. It is a complex, multifaceted ecosystem, and all the parts of it are important. And you have new entrants that aren't just thinking new platforms or new innovations. They're structured as companies differently. Partly, there are billionaires out there funding them. They're all, what SpaceX was looking for was a revenue stream. And a lot of these companies that have a lot of venture capital backing are starting to signal funding rounds are ending, we need contracts. And of course that goes back to resource and goes back to competition to keep the DIB vibrant. But the department is thinking about this. I know you are, Bill LaPlante is, about how to think about companies. There's quite a bit of government-funded research and development, but there are a lot of new entrants that are paying for their own R&D as well, and thinking about how you develop a contract or how you put a dollar sign against that, what you're buying, intellectual property, commercial products, these types of things. So they can exist outside the system because of the support they have, but I think we should be cautious about taking that for granted, because that can be the opposite of resiliency too, if we get one company that becomes dominant for launch or satellite communications or whatever it is. So we need to think through that and make sure, because as David pointed out, that supply chain can dry up as well and isn't there for whatever you need next or for competition.
The only other point I'd make is, coming off of what Eric said, is vertical integration. A lot of companies are going more and more vertical, as you've seen the merger and acquisition activity. So that runs counter to resiliency. So yeah, SpaceX is really successful. They basically control their destiny very well, and they built the company around that from the get-go. Many of the companies have been on longer cycles over a number of decades, or have been accomplishing a lot through capitalization via their partners and others, and that's starting to diminish. So we're losing resiliency because we're getting fewer and fewer companies that are going to be able to deliver what's needed. So it's back to the original point that the industry is way smaller than it was when we modernized or built the original triad.
I think the example of SpaceX is a very unique example, one, because of the billionaire backing, but two, because it's about, Eric said earlier, when he was in government, he didn't really understand the different business models that drive industry. SpaceX has a very different business model of how they make their money than some of the more traditional DIB participants. And I think to the question of, are there things to learn? I do certainly think there are things to learn from the rise of SpaceX. One is speed. Two, another thing I think that we can learn and that industry saw is, there was a big push by the government for open standards and other non-proprietary data. But when the capability was so compelling, the government was willing to compromise that, because SpaceX modems are proprietary, right? Many of the things that we in the more traditional part of the DIB had thought were non-negotiable have been shown to be negotiable depending on how critical the capability is. So I think it really goes down to understanding what is the business model of the critical components of the DIB that we're relying on, for, in this case, nuclear modernization. How can that be leveraged for the good of our nation and to make sure that we're well prepared against a peer adversary? But I also think we need to make sure we're not taking outliers, right, and making that a monolithic statement.
Great. Well, we have time for just another lightning round before we're going to hear from General Cotton. And it's okay for just a yes or no answer to this question. We've talked a lot about the challenge around manufacturing as well as workforce. Are you optimistic or pessimistic that the United States is moving in the right direction in this area?
I'm optimistic. I mean, I'll always bet in favor of the United States.
Absolutely, I agree.
Totally agree.
Doug?
Optimism is my nature, but optimism is my nature. But there's a lot of really smart people working these problems on both sides, the government and industry, so we will solve it. We just got to keep working with urgency.
Yeah, I'm also optimistic. I think, we as a nation can adapt better than anyone, and we've shown that time and again. So optimistic, and we need to make changes.
Great. Well, that was actually a lightning round minor break. I was just told we can go to 3:50, so we have a lot more questions and a lot to look forward to here in the next 20 minutes. Let's pivot a little bit to current events and talk about some of the support that the United States is providing along with allies in Ukraine and some of the lessons we have learned from an industrial perspective there. And what are some of your key lessons or takeaways, particularly related to the nuclear industry or nuclear enterprise?
Well, I guess I'll start. The first one would be in the nuclear enterprise. I think there are occasions in the broader enterprise where we can, through trusted partners, trusted countries, develop additional supply chains to support that. So I think that is definitely in the trade space. It's not completely ground ruled out of the nuclear enterprise with the proper relationships and controls. The only other example I might be able to cite too is we are a major partner on the F-35 program, which, by the way, is a nuclear element of the air leg in its own way. And partnering with a company like AG Rheinmetall and to build F-35 fuselages in Germany is something we've recently done. And 5 years ago, that would have been unheard of to done that in that particular country to the scale it's being done. But obviously, the world has changed a lot. So that's one example.
Other thoughts? Elaine?
One other, I'll take it maybe from a little bit of a different angle. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, we had one of our subsidiaries, because we are dual, commercial military serving both markets, producing certain components for some power and control items in Russia. And of course, then there were sanctions, right? And we had to immediately cease doing our business in Russia, or obviously, jeopardize penalty of sanctions. And so one of the things that we found was we needed to immediately resource this particular component, which had not been built in the United States for over 20 years, right? All the drawings, all the tooling, everything was in our factory in Russia, written in Russian, et cetera. But one of the things we looked at in the way to solve this very challenging problem goes back to one of the points I brought up earlier. So we were faced with this challenge, we put a Tiger team on it, and what we said was, okay, we need to move all this stuff back, that's going to take time, and we have parts on aircraft that need to come off sooner. Have we looked at what the inspection requirements and other certification requirements are of those parts? And are they too strict for all the data that we now have? Could we actually go back and say that safely these parts could operate longer, and that could give us more time to restart the production here in the United States? And so we did that. We partnered with our customer, we showed them a bunch of analysis, and we determined that we could actually have the parts on for longer. And this goes back to, one, the innovation, and why I'm optimistic about the future of the defense industrial base, but two, showing that the certification requirements we had 20 years ago when we put this in place, they're not necessarily what's needed to safely operate today. And so when we look at the problem holistically, which is what we learned from, the situation resulting from the war in Ukraine, we can find innovative ways to solve problems.
So just two quick things. One is, Eric made the wise point that the last year of the POM, the 6-year plan, is where the problems live. For many, many years, that's where the triad modernization lived, because everyone said, well, this is a really tough year, we've got sequestration, we've got something else, we'll just slide the modernization a little bit, right? It's been X number of decades, we can wait a little bit longer. Up until the point where you couldn't wait any longer, because the existing systems all had clocks, and everyone in the room is familiar with this. But it never got better, right? There was never a point where the answer was, now we have plenty of top line. We at some point, we're going to have to absorb that once-in-a-generation modernization, while at the same time dealing with China, dealing with Ukraine, dealing with the other things. And so part of that is overcoming the temptation to think that there'll be a point in the future where you won't have to make the hard choice, so I push it off. The other one I'm just going to steal from the EUCOM commander, General Cavoli, because he spoke about this, about the conflict in Ukraine. He said two interesting things. One is the incredible value of old school technology like artillery in volume. That still matters in a large conflict. And the other one is the short life of some of the most innovative technologies before tactics, techniques, and countermeasures cause them to have to be replaced, updated, or changed in order to survive. And so part of that was the need to think about how quickly you could adapt, because the innovative technology will end up with a surprising half-life in the middle of the conflict.
A follow-on question that builds off of what, Dave, you've just articulated. There's been a lot of discussion around the need to be able to build new capabilities with speed and agility, particularly as we see the peer competitor, near peer competitor threat evolving at a faster speed than necessarily was anticipated. What things are you seeing or hearing from companies in industry that's working well towards that goal? And is there certain things that the government should be doing differently by way of policies or approaches that it should be adopting or encouraging to help in this area?
I can give you some ideas. Oh, who you wanted me to start?
And anyone who volunteers,
sorry.
please.
Okay, got it. I thought you said Dave. I was reflecting on that question and thinking about some of the things that are going on around modernization on a program like B-21, where, it's still early days, but that requirement for the open architecture is everything, because it really is allowing us to adapt. And all what that means, if you're not familiar with the term, is kind of like 10, 15 years ago when you bought your printer and brought it home, you were like playing with DVDs, whatever those were, and changing the software in order to be able to hook up your printer. Well, nowadays, you just bring everything home, you plug it in, and it goes. And the extent that we're able to get those on our weapon systems today is going to allow us to be more resilient to the threat as it moves towards it. Also, in the way we conduct our software development is also a key part of that. But it's to the points that Elaine was making earlier on certification. All these new commercial tools that are being brought in, the certification communities have to come along for the ride in terms of how we're using those tools, so that when the product comes out the back end, they buy into the certification and then it's not an add-on. So I think that's a key part of the agility piece that's starting to happen, but needs to happen more broadly.
The one I'd flag is prototyping and putting things in the hands of the warfighter. When somebody has an innovative idea, if you can get it in the hand of a user, let them work with it. You did two things. One is a demand signal, and inside the department, a demand signal from a combatant command saying, I need this, it helps, is key. And the other part is you start to realize what's incomplete about the solution you have versus the need. I mean, the most dramatic example is, many years back, but Predator. Predator was built by DARPA. There wasn't a demand signal for it. It couldn't pass OT&E because it didn't work in the rain. But in CENTCOM, the answer was it was so vastly better than anything they had, they absolutely wanted it right away. And that demand signal pulled that system into it, and so launched a lot of the UAVs. So whenever we can put something in the hands of a user and they can say, this really makes a difference, that helps drive the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I would like to build on that. I agree that putting things in the hand of the user, especially in experimentation where we can see the operational utility, is really important, and it can drive a demand signal. But one of the things I think we found recently, especially in the focus on JADC2 and trying to field capabilities rapidly, is the acquisition system is not yet prepared to deal with that demand signal, right? Because you don't have a traditional JSIDS document, right? You maybe not have been through the PPVE process. And so I think while we are thinking about how do we get things in the hands of the warfighter, what is the acquisition model if something does demonstrate operational utility? How do we get that through the cycle faster? And so I think there are, policy things that should be looked at from that perspective.
I think I'm absolutely getting things into the hands of warfighters as quickly as possible, but in some type of environment, a test environment, whatever, where it can be red teamed too, because as David said, we're seeing how fast things become obsolete in Ukraine, how quickly things are changing, which is the nature of how innovation is different. We don't buy something for 25 years anymore now. It's like, your iPhone is constantly updating, and that a lot of what we're buying is that way now too. And so we can't do things in series anymore. They have to be done in parallel, and we have to think about what actually the product is, because our cycles are much longer than innovation cycles are in this day and age. David and I were on a commission, the only thing sexier than an acquisition commission, the PPBE commission, focusing on how do you get Congress and the department aligned to be able to react quicker to what industry is doing and innovating, because it's just, that's a, Department of Defense kills words really well. Remember, transformation. Innovation is another one. It means different things to different people. But I think for industry, for technological industry, which includes the defense industrial base, innovation is something that is nonstop. It's not just an idea or a platform. It is software and how we upgrade and how we update. It never ends. And we have to figure out how we get better at accepting that, incorporating that, funding that, getting congressional approval for it, getting it through. And then there's lots of great examples in the department, rapid capabilities offices, DIU or what have you. But on the end of all of this, the department's got to buy things at scale. That's how you incentivize this investment. Because another thing that I didn't really think about when I was in government, there are a lot of people who think defense companies should just be government agencies because everything's bought by the government. Well, first of all, we know that we really wouldn't produce very much if they became government agencies. But second of all, these companies that exist in the private sector, they are attracting investment, private investment, which is really important. It's what the department purchases that then leverages this private investment. And to do that, they need to see some return on the other end. And so the experimental part is great. Figuring out, getting a demand signal, but then you got to buy it at scale to continue attracting that investment that is really just leveraging the taxpayer dollars.
Great. A question for you with regards to allies and partners. There's been a lot of discussion with regards to both bringing capabilities back to the United States, investing here domestically, whether that be starting with critical minerals, all the way through manufacturing and workforce. But then there also equally is efforts to do co-production, co-sustainment, areas where with our closest allies. How do you think about that balance between what should we be having indigenously here in the United States, and where are there some areas where we are reliant very much so on our allies and partners, and how does industry think about that balance?
I think one of the ways we can leverage that, and one of the things that's particularly exciting about the changes with AUKUS, is in pooling our S&T investment into some of these more emerging capabilities. One I'll point out is quantum. I think the Chinese have been very focused on quantum. I think there's more that we should be doing. And now with AUKUS opening up the ability to collaborate from an S&T perspective, without ITAR restrictions, I think we could look at how, with our allies and partners, do we really go faster in some of those emerging things that would be evolutionary for, in particular, how nuclear capability and nuclear strategic comms could be done differently. So that's one way I think we could leverage that would be positively seen by the defense industrial base.
I think the other thing you look at is where is there a technology or capability, right, where an ally or partner has a particular capability that you can then build off of, versus one of you just has to build it from scratch, right? If one of you's got it, there's an economy of scale advantage of taking advantage of the other one's participation in it. It also matters if it's a system the other country's likely to use in its own defense, because then it has a particular need to keep promoting it, developing, driving quantities for their own consumption as well. And then that helps build additional sources of production that complicate both strengthen the industrial base, but also complicate targeting if the other side decides they're going to try and disrupt production.
The next question I think is probably best, Eric, for you and Dave, and it relates to, with small companies and startups, the issue around adversarial capital and how well that is something that is of concern to some of your members, and what the how well understood is that threat, and what some of the implications are broadly for the defense industrial base on that?
That's a good question. You know, we want to attract private investment so that we can leverage, again, that taxpayer investment. And so there's a lot of great investment out there coming in different forms, private equity, venture capital. But that's another world that's not monolithic, and that we, and I'd say we, meaning the defense world, the Department of Defense, needs to understand better, because it's increasingly an element in the defense industrial base. The adversarial capital, I think there's two things we have to watch. One is investments coming from adversaries, giving them control over things. We have to be very thoughtful and very careful about that. And I think the department's doing a pretty good job and getting even better at tracking that. But there's another component, which is there's non-adversarial investment that is causing problems in the supply chain by driving up costs. Finding where there are elements in the supply chain where you've got the 1 point of failure, or maybe 2 points, and you can combine them into one, and then being able to raise the cost, which creates not just problems for the Department of Defense or even the big companies, but a lot of our smaller companies too, that all of a sudden find they have a real supply problem themselves because someone bought the sole supplier that they have. So I think both of those are things that we have to watch very carefully, and it feeds into the previous question, I think, about allies and partners. We should be leaning into that as much as we can. We don't have the capacity to do, Ukraine showed us that. We wouldn't have been able to support that country ourselves. We had to do it collectively. And we have to be careful about, you know, where we prioritize what we bring back to the United States. I would do it with a very clear national security focus, linked to, you know, economic advantage for the United States. And then really making sure that we're careful about where money is coming from outside the United States.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the advantages of the market is it moves money really fast. One of the challenges is if you care about who owns what, this becomes complicated. So the adversarial capital is a reference to a foreign government deciding the best way to get access to a technology in the U.S. is simply acquire the company or to invest in the company. And so we have a very extensive process called CFIUS, which actually stands for something strange, Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S., okay, great, which many of us have been part of, which looks at those types of investment and flags them when they can see a foreign investment in a technology that we think is critical to the United States. The challenge for small businesses is they tend not to have the resources necessarily to see or to know all the sources of capital. They may know the name of the organization, but who has invested in it, who has people in that organization, and therefore would potentially have access. So there's been this concept of trusted capital, of trying to identify those forms of capital investment where we know where the money's coming in from, and therefore can assure a business that these are reliable places. And private capital and others have been working to try and flag this. But it's a relatively complicated area, and there's a lot of elaborate controls that go in place to try and prevent this, but it is absolutely a challenge.
Let's talk a little bit about digital tools and the degree to which they're really having a major impact on the nuclear modernization effort kind of across the board. Doug or Elaine, do you want to kick us off on that?
I'll start on that. So there's sort of the Born Digital, which is something like Sentinel for us, where we really started from the ground up, implementing the digital tool sets. B-21 got there very quickly on the front end and is flourishing under that. But digital tools have been around for a long time. You know, the B-2 was designed in 3 dimensions and had all computer-aided design at the time. But what's happened in the last 20 years is the proliferation of commercially based tools that were used for all kinds of applications. Hence, you have a huge tech industry out there, the big five I mentioned. Those tools have been alive and well in the commercial environment and are rapidly evolving. So bringing those into a military-grade environment where you're dealing with all the requirement sets that come from certifications, dealing with the security levels and adapting them to digital, that's really now where that's starting to manifest in this transformation we're seeing in these weapon systems for deterrence. And so that unlocks things at the functional level where we can integrate physical designs much more rapidly and find errors sooner and be able to discover those and fix them. Virtual reality inside the factory, taking tools that now been around for 10 years in the virtual world and now applying them in a factory and in sustainment. And then in the functional world, how we do agile software. So now if there's a threat that comes up that requires a software mod, we can do that in hours rather than days, weeks, or months that it used to be in the past. And then finally, cloud migration, just another basic thing that's out there. We're all used to it. We live in that ecosystem, but that's been coming over the last 10 years and is now finally a reality in terms of how we're going to manage large volumes of data that these systems generate in the sustainment realm and in the mission realm.
Great, thank you. Elaine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I actually think the nuclear enterprise has done a great job. Like Sentinel was mentioned, SAOC was all digital model from the beginning of the acquisition, so is EXX, right? So I think that has really been embraced on the front end as far as how you do design and development. I think where the opportunity is now that we have all of these, how can we use that to streamline some of the certification challenges that we talked about? And I think that's an area that's still underexplored.
Great. Now we truly are at the end. And I want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to mention something that we have not talked about today, but that you want to make sure the audience walks away with.
Okay, I'll start. It kind of wraps a lot of things up. Over the last couple of decades, the whole DIB process has been set up for efficiency. So think just in time and low price, technically acceptable, LPTA. That's how we've been living, and now we have to live under a model of capacity-based. If Ukraine has taught us anything, we've got to rethink all these models we're talking about here from a capacity perspective.
We didn't stumble into this. We have the industrial base we contract for. If you contract for just-in-time, you get just-in-time. If you include and value surge capacity, if you include and value the ability to have multiple suppliers, then firms will do that. Where we are right now is there's a number of good places in the government where they are pushing on the accelerator to drive change, multi-year contracts, and so on. But there are also places that are also standing on the brake. And so while we're making progress from industry, what you're seeing is some parts pushing some way, some parts putting the other, which means part of our challenge going forward is looking for where there are feet on the brake and trying to get those off so that those reforms go fully implemented.
I think I'll go back to something you said at the start about the number of companies in the defense industrial base that are also doing non-defense work. And so as David said, we've talked about that the contours of the industrial base, the defense industrial base, are shaped by government decisions. On the non-defense side and aerospace, you have a duopoly like there's no other example of it in the world, Airbus and Boeing. And they have been competing very hard for years and years and years and years and years and driving efficiencies and leaning out their supply chain. So it was happening on both sides. So you have the supply chain that the two sides have created. Then what I would say is obviously different incentives, different perspectives, government and industry, but it's not adversarial, it's a partnership. We shouldn't treat it as an adversarial relationship. It is the competitive advantage for the United States. Nobody else has what we have, and so we need to lean into it always as a partnership and make sure we're protecting the industrial base.
And my closing comments are, there was a lot of discussion about urgency, and I want to make sure the customer base here knows the DIB understands the urgency, we feel it, and we want to respond. Like Eric said, it is a partnership, though. We need to see urgency in resolving some of these items that are slowing us down in the critical path as well, so that we can deliver these capabilities our nation needs.
Great. So join me in thanking each of our panelists, and thank you very much for your insights.